Hello friends, welcome back to ABN and the Trinity Channel. It is a blessing to have you here with us during the second International Apologetics Marathon of 2016. My name is Tony Gurule, I'm your host, and it's a pleasure to be here and to have you here with us as we proclaim the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ and defend the historic Christian faith to the world around us. You are probably watching on ABN's Trinity Channel website, trinitychannel.com, or you may be watching live on YouTube or live on Facebook. Whichever way you're watching, tell your friends and family to tune in to our shows, especially this one, because this is going to be a great show. I've really been looking forward to it. And today is day 2 of a 2-week marathon that's happening here at ABN. So we would encourage you to tune in for all of our shows and then take those and share them on Facebook, Twitter, or anywhere else on social media that you are. But this show is going to be very exciting. It's going to be very eye-opening to many people around the world. It's going to be very equipping to the Christians out there who don't know about Islam and its primary sources. I want to introduce to you a couple of amazing Skype guests who we have tonight. But first, I want to introduce to you who we have in the studio once again. I'm blessed to have with me right here to my right, Pastor Joseph, who is no stranger to ABN and the Trinity Channel. He actually has his own show on Tuesday evenings now, and I encourage you to tune into that. That's going to be a regular weekly show, right. And it just turned out that tonight, which his show would have taken place, He's here with us during this marathon. To my far right, I have Joe Carey, who has a master's degree in apologetics from Biola University, and he has been studying Islam and reaching Muslims with the gospel for many years. So it's a blessing to call him a friend. It's a blessing to have him be a brother in Christ to all of us, because we need definitely more Christians reaching out to Muslims. Now, this show is called Primary Sources, Whose Are Most Reliable? This is a vital question that we need to ask, because the two largest religious groups in the world are Christians, being a little over 2 billion in the world, and then Muslims, about 1.6 billion. We have the Quran and the Hadith and the Sirah with Muslims. We have the New Testament and, of course, the whole Bible for Christians. The Bible and the Quran alone say contradictory things, which tell us, if we are thinking critically about this, they can't both be true. One is true and one is false. Now, it's not just what we believe that matters, but it's where does the evidence point to? And if we look outside of the Bible, outside of the Quran, what does archaeology tell us? What does history tell us? And what does history point to as what is true, reliable, and actually corresponds to reality and actual history? So it is an honor for me to introduce our first Skype guest tonight. His name is Dr. Daniel Janosik. He received his PhD in historical theology and apologetics from the London School of Theology, with his dissertation on John of Damascus, a first apologist to the Muslims. He also received his undergraduate degree from the College of William and Mary and his MDiv and Master's in Islamic Studies from Columbia International University. Dr. Janosik is an adjunct professor of apologetics and Islamic Studies at Southern Evangelical Seminary and Columbia International University. He has taught biology and apologetics for over 20 years and has done extensive research, teaching in the area of the major world religions in cults and the creation-evolution controversy, and more recently in Islamic studies. He has written 2 books, which I'm waiting for both of them to be released. I can't wait to get them. John of Damascus, First Apologist to the Muslims, and a second book called A Christian's Guide to Islam. He's also written a number of articles, and actually I just happen to have one right here next to me, in Insights to Islam, a pamphlet put out by the Melbourne School of Theology. And Dr. Janosik has an article in here called The Real Story Behind the Massacre of the Banu Qurayza. So I recommend that you pick that up, as well as his upcoming books. But he has spoken on college campuses and churches throughout the United States and in England, Mexico, China, and Japan, where he also served as a missionary. So Dr. Janosik, it is a blessing for me, because you have been a mentor of mine for the last 6 years. I talk about your classes all the time and what a great professor you are and how you have single-handedly put John of Damascus on the map, which is someone that a lot of people don't know about. Christians don't know about him, and Muslims do not know about him, but we're going to get into that tonight. So it is truly an honor for me to have you here, Dr. Janosik.
Thank you, Tony. It's good for me to be with you all, and I look forward to interacting with Pastor Joseph and Joe Carey, and also Richard Shumack, who you'll be introducing. This is going to be a good night, good topic.
Definitely, definitely. And I mean, it doesn't take away from the rest of this week or next week, but this show, the way it was created, the way that it was organized, I'm really excited. And this is a show that people need to share online, because not only do we have Dr. Daniel Janosik, but we also have Dr. Richard Shumack. And he is a research fellow with the Center for Public Christianity, which is in Sydney, Australia, and the director of the Arthur Jeffrey Center for Islamic Studies at the Melbourne School of Theology, which again is the school that puts out these pamphlets, which have very good articles in them. He's part of the Ravi Zacharias International Ministries Understanding and Answering Islam team. And he teaches regularly on engaging with Islam in Australian seminaries, universities, churches, and mission organizations. Dr. Shumack is the author of 2 books, and I happen to have them right here with me as well. First one is Witnessing to Western Muslims, a Worldview Approach to Sharing Faith. You need to pick that one up. And also his philosophical apologetic entitled The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity. Don't let the title fool you. This is a great book with great content. And also, as you will hear from his accent, Dr. Richard Shumack is from Australia, from down under. So I can't just call him a friend. He is an official mate. So Dr. Shumack, thank you for being with us on the show tonight.
Absolute pleasure, Tony.
Thank you for being here. And
yes, really a mate, and good to have new mates as well in Joe and Joseph. I know Daniel for a long time, and he's a mate also.
Right. And we're all having a little bit of audio trouble with Dr. Shumack's Skype. I don't know if we can work on that, get that fixed. Yeah, and turn up his volume just a little bit if we can, because we want to make sure that the worldwide audience who's watching this now and in the reruns are going to get this information, because these guests, folks, these 2 scholars have, I would say, cutting-edge information on the history of Islam and, of course, the history of the world in reality of what actually happened back in the day. What happened at the time of Muhammad, before Muhammad, after Muhammad, and how does that compare to the Islamic worldview that many Muslims hold today? And of course, even compared to the teachings about Islam that are found in your secular school books. Because this show tonight is going to critique very tightly the Islamic worldview and what Muslims believe about Muhammad, about the Quran, and about what they believe is the history of the world. That's going to be refuted tonight. And I have another professor who recently told me, if you think about it, people tend to erect the most protective structures around things that are weak, not things that are strong. And in Islam, it's heresy to question the Quran. It's heresy to question Muhammad and his teachings and his history. So this is a vital show for you to watch in its entirety, and a vital show for you to share with everyone, your Muslim neighbors who you love, and your Christian brothers and sisters in Christ who need this information as well. So with our great scholars here, I have a number of questions that I want to ask them. And I will start with Dr. Janosik, because you have done some cutting-edge work on John of Damascus, and many Muslims out there who have done their work, they have done their research. If we look to a historical timeline, we see, okay, Muhammad died in 632. Ibn Ishaq, who was the writer of the earliest biography of Muhammad, died in 767, which is Ibn Hisham's work. Al-Bukhari died in 870, and Bukhari's student died in 932. But you, sir, have done some vital work that has filled in the gaps between 632 and 767, because your work on John of Damascus is a man who lived from 674 to 749. So I want to ask you, what does John of Damascus say about the status of the Quran in the 8th century? And why does this indicate that the Quran was still being written over 100 years after Muhammad's death?
Question, and I'm glad you picked up on John of Damascus, because I think he's a key person in this whole discussion. Again, John lived right in the midst of the first 100 years of Islam. I pegged him at 675 to about 749, 750. So 75 years of living within the Muslim context, because by the time he was born, he was in a city, Damascus, Syria, that was already taken over or conquered by the Arabs. In fact, his grandfather was the mayor of the city, and his grandfather surrendered the city in 638. So just a few years after Muhammad's death, according to the traditional sources, the Arabs had conquered Damascus. The city was surrendered so that there would not be any rampant killing, and so he saved the city. And John's grandfather also saved his job, which was the chief tax collector of the whole area. And John's grandfather became the tax collector for the whole Umayyad Empire, which developed there in Damascus. That was passed on to John's father, and then when John was about 24, 25 years old, working under the Caliph Abdul Malik, John became the chief tax collector of the whole empire. He had a very high position. He was a very devout Christian in the in what we would call the Eastern Orthodox tradition, which was the favored tradition of the Byzantine Empire at that time. The Byzantines had retreated, and that's why the Arabs had come up into that area and had a pretty easy time conquering the cities. But John was an eyewitness. He was an eyewitness to what was going on, and that is why he is so important. And the question that you ask is, what did he know about the Quran? Well, he knew a lot more than just about anybody else that we can grab hold of at that time, because the Muslims were not writing things down. The Quran is supposedly the first book in the whole literature of the Muslims in Arabic. Arabic was a developing language at this time, and we see this in John's work. He wrote a treatise called The Heresy of the Ishmaelites, probably around 743. At this time, he had served the Caliph for a number of years, probably around 717, 18. Right in there, he retired. He became a priest and a monk. He went off to the monastery. In this monastery, St. Sabas, it was near Jerusalem. He had freedom to teach and write, and he wrote many things. The Heresy of the Ishmaelite is a great document, and that's what I really go into in my book, the whole analysis of that. But as far as the Quran, he did not mention the existence of the Quran. This is 743. He didn't mention the existence of the Quran. He referred to what we would know as surahs, certain surahs now, as writings, or graphe in Greek. He wrote in Greek. But he talked about them as if they were separate writings, separate booklets. And the only ones he referred to would have been Surah 2, 4, and 5. We know these as Medinan surahs, which were toward the end of Muhammad's time of receiving these revelations, and they have more of the verses that deal with government structure and also war between the Arabs and the non-Muslims. So he had some knowledge of those, but again, he also had a mixture of other material that he put in there. For example, he called one of those writings the book of the she-camel. There is no Quran named the she-camel. There are some verses scattered throughout, probably 16, 18 different verses referring to this she-camel. But John goes on for about a sixth of his whole document talking about this, what's in this surah. And it's ludicrous. It talks about a she-camel going up to heaven and drinking the rivers up there and getting in trouble and so on. And it may be that the Arabs at that time realized that this should not be in their holy book, and so they pulled it out. So he may have brought that about. But it certainly indicates, and this is probably the bottom line, now then I'll let you go on. This indicates that a 7th century canonization of the Quran did not occur. Most likely, it was mid to late 8th century that the Quran was put together, canonized, collected, and finalized. And there are other reasons for that that we'll get to. But John is a very, very important person in this whole discussion.
Definitely. And I not only thank you for that great info that people need to be aware of, but pick up Dr. Janosik's new book on John of Damascus. You can actually order it you can pre-order it right now on Amazon, the paperback or the hardcover, and it's going to be full of great historical information, I guarantee you. Now, at the same time, as we talk about and critique the Quran and how it actually came about, at the same time, we want to talk about the Bible, because a lot of Muslims believe that the Bible's been corrupted. That's their only explanation for the fact that it says that Jesus died on a cross, and the Quran says that he didn't. They look to the Quran. If that's true, well, then the Bible must have been changed in every way that it contradicts the Quran. So I want to go to Dr. Shumack, and thinking of this doctrine of Tarif, that the Bible was changed. Is it possible that the New Testament could have been deliberately changed to begin with?
Well, certainly not in the way it's described. So even if you'd wanted to, and we can talk, as Christians, we tend to talk about the various texts that we have and the evidence that texts haven't been changed. But even if we put aside the text history that we have, the way that the Bible came into existence was that it was written in multiple, take the Gospels, they were written in multiple cities by different authors. They were then sent in the sort of interlocking chain through all the different churches, made copies of them and passed them along. There was never the opportunity to gather it all back and to deliberately change any of it. So the only changes we really have are small changes that scribes made accidentally. And we have good reasons to see why that accident might have happened. But it would have been impossible, literally impossible, to gather everything and intentionally change it to distort it. Just couldn't have happened.
Okay. And I think, obviously, one of the reasons why it couldn't have happened, and I'm sure you're getting to this, is that the amount of manuscripts that had been copied and spread throughout that area between the time of Jesus, around 33, and in the 1st century, and then all of a sudden, I mean, Muhammad wasn't even born until 570 according to tradition. So that's quite a few hundred years there to be copying biblical manuscripts and spreading them around. So what would be the possibilities be of going and finding every single one of these manuscripts, changing them, and then getting them back out there in circulation? I mean, it's impossible for it to take place.
No, that's exactly right. And not only that, we have no evidence that any sort of intentional, deliberate shaping of the New Testament ever happened. Ironically, many Muslims will accuse Christians of deliberately changing it and then destroying other copies. But the irony is that only Islam has, within their tradition, a clear record that they destroyed copies of the Quran that they didn't think were fit the norm or fit the authoritative text. But there's no record of that ever happening in Christianity.
So actually, as part of the traditional story, we read that Uthman, the third caliph, actually burned manuscripts, and that's part of the traditional story. But we don't find that, of course, like you said, in Christianity. And also, since that's the case, it lets us know that the Quran was a controlled text from the beginning, where that isn't the case with the Bible. You know, that was spread around, and it didn't become controlled until much later on.
Well, just a clarification for
Yeah.
our viewers, the Quran was a controlled text, but not from the very beginning, because before Uthman, the third caliph, there is the evidence, Ibn Masud, Umar ibn al-Khattab, differing codices. So I know you know that, but I want to make sure our viewers understand it wasn't controlled from the very beginning. It was controlled, though, shortly thereafter, because of the problems that came evident.
And that's actually why Uthman had to order the various competing manuscripts to be burned, because they were fighting amongst one another as to who possessed the proper Quran.
Right.
Well, we read, okay, they said that they were pronouncing words wrong. Joe, what do you say? what's your illustration that you use when Muslims say, oh yeah, they were pronouncing it wrong, that's why we destroyed them?
Yeah, the idea is that Uthman ordered the competing Qurans burned not because there were differences in the text, but because there were differences in the recitation or the pronunciation of the text. And I always use the illustration when I lecture on this, that picture yourself, we have a book. And we have a book in the United States with a picture of a red ripe fruit that we call a tomato. Now, suppose we have that same book in the United Kingdom, same red fruit, same word spelled the same way. How do they pronounce it? They pronounce it tomato. So the Muslim argument is that we burned the book that said tomato because they were mispronouncing it. We copied our book, sent it to the UK so that they would pronounce that word differently.
Well, and on top of that, the tashkil, the dots that bring the pronunciation, were not added until much later in the Arabic language.
That's right.
So even if people were bringing a different accent, that wasn't in the text. You can't destroy the accent in the text because there was no points to make an accent or to change it whatsoever.
Definitely.
It makes no sense.
And you're referring to the diacritical marks.
The diacritical marks.
Exactly. I think in Arabic, tashkil, which,
And those came much later.
Right.
Because Arabic's a consonantal language.
Yes, it's a ridiculous, nonsensical argument.
It's a ridiculous argument.
Yeah.
It has no basis in fact.
Right.
Well, we do still have some time left before we have to take our first commercial break. So it's a blessing to have you here with us. And friends, your support of ABN and the Trinity Channel are what allow these marathons to take place. As you can hear, this is vital information. This is information that just about, I'd say, every Muslim does not know, but many Christians don't know. And the Christians who are out there saying, I want to reach my Muslim neighbor with the truth because I care about them, I love them, what can I say to them? Now, obviously, this is probably not the best topic or the best details to bring up right from the get-go after you say hello to a Muslim, but this is information that you want to have as a Christian in order to share it with your Muslim friends when the topics do come up, okay? Getting back to Dr. Janosik, the Quran seems to have borrowed from pre-Islamic sources, Christian liturgy, Jewish commentaries, Arabic poetry, and Greek legends. So how does the inclusion of these hybrid stories affect the view that the Quran is an eternal book from Allah, that it always existed, and that the Quran that we have in our hands today is just a finite copy of that eternal book?
Okay. Another great question. And what's behind this is something that perhaps I need to at least mention. In my research, I am more of, I would say, a revisionist in the sense that a lot of the earlier records or stories, the traditional view of the development of the Quran involving Muhammad and Umar and the early caliphs and the first written record 20 years after his death, I find that to be more speculative because we do not have any written documents that that verify that. In fact, we don't have anything mentioning Muhammad himself by Muslims until 691, and that's at the Dome of the Rock. So some of the stuff that I'm going to share may sound a little bit different, but it's the evidence that we're uncovering, and there are a lot of other scholars who are uncovering and documenting the same things. And so one statement that needs to be understood is that if the Quran is not directly from God, then it is a human document. And since it claims a perfect divine source, human authorship would undercut its authority. In fact, there's a scholar, Stephen Humphreys, who states boldly that, quote, if the Quran is a historical document, then the whole Islamic struggle of 14 centuries is effectively meaningless because it's a book that was written by humans. One aspect of that is that there are a number of these stories, Christian liturgy involved in the Quran, Jewish commentaries, Arabic poetry, and Greek legends. For one, Sidney Griffith, who's a Syriac expert, teaches at the Catholic University, writes about the story of the Companions of the Cave. And it's a Syriac version written in a 6th century document that we have by Jacob of Serug, who lived between 451 and 521. It talks about these 7 young men who go into a cave, they fall asleep for 100 years or so, they wake up, and when they fall asleep, it's a time of persecution under Diocletian. They wake up, and it's a time when Christians are prevailing, and they go into town, and it's just totally different. Well, we find that there are allusions to this particular story in Surah 18, verses 19 to 26. What is that story doing in the Quran if it's an eternal book? It's a story that did not happen. It's a mythological story that's in Greek Christian mythology. And so that's one. Another one is written about by Reuben Firestone, who's a great scholar. And he talks about Abraham visiting Ishmael. And here he notes that in Genesis, the visitation stories of Abraham show that he never visited Ishmael after Ishmael grew up and left. But the traditional stories of the Arabs put this in, that he went down to Arabia, visited Ishmael, and he got Ishmael an Arab wife, not an Egyptian one, which is what happens in Genesis, in the Bible, in the Old Testament. So it's a very different story. And Reuben Firestone's point is that there's a lot of what is called Arabization of these early Old Testament stories. So yes, you do have Old Testament prophets and narratives in the Quran, but they're changed. There are things added. For example, the Cain and Abel story, there's this raven that scratches on the ground to show Adam that Cain buried Abel. And yet that raven is not in the Genesis account. It's not in the Bible. It is in a 3rd century AD addition to a Jewish Targum, a commentary. And so here we have something that did not happen, was not biblical, that was put in. And then finally, I would mention Kevin Van Bladel and the Syriac legends, because he mentions the story of the Dual al-Qurnayn, or the two-horned one, found in the Quran, Surah 18, 83 to 101. This refers to Alexander the Great. And this is the story of Alexander going to the east and the west and finding the sun setting in a muddy pool in the west and so on. Well, that's a story that was written in about 628, during the supposed time of Muhammad's life. It's a recent story. What is it doing in the Quran? And that's what I'm saying, that there are a lot of these stories, a lot of the narratives that have been either Arabized or changed. So it shows that there's a deliberate sense of pulling something together for a purpose. And I believe that purpose came toward the time that John of Damascus lived under the rule of the Caliph Abdul Malik.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to definitely get into more about him and the epigraphy. I'll explain what that word is here in just a little bit. And also, we have Dr. Richard Shumack as well, in addition to Dr. Janosik. So we need to take a short break. But please, during this break, go to Amazon and look up Dr. Shumack's books, The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity, Witnessing to Western Muslims, A Worldview Approach to Sharing Faith, and look up John of Damascus and type in Daniel Janosik's name, because you'll be able to pre-order that book, which is coming out within the next few months. So as you can hear, this is a great show, great information that needs to be shared and uploaded to wherever you want to upload it or share it after it is available on YouTube, usually within 1 hour of the show's ending. So it's great to have you here, and we will see you in just a couple of minutes.
Live English debate, Thursday, September 15th, between Jonathan McLatchie and Akil Oku. The debate will be held at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The topic? What does the Quran say about the Bible? For more information, call the numbers on your screen or visit our website at www.trinitychannel.com.
ABN viewers, to watch free reruns of our marathon shows, apologetic shows, and English programs, go to www.youtube.com and type Trinity Channel. Here at ABN, we make it easier for viewers like you to watch programs. For more information, call us at 248-416-1300. Thank you for watching and supporting ABN channels. If God places it on your heart, please call now to donate at 248-416-1300 or visit us at www.trinitychannel.com or send checks to our P.O. Box 724, Walled Lake, Michigan 48390.
Hello, friends, and welcome back to ABN and the Trinity Channel for the second International Apologetics Marathon of 2016. It's a blessing to have you here because there's a whole lot of shows on different channels that you could be watching right now. So it's a blessing to have you here watching this show, listening to this vital information that we are sharing in this program. This show is called Primary Texts, Whose Are More Trustworthy? And to inform you about this vital question is, to my right, Pastor Joe Carey from RadicalTruth.net, and on the Skype line, we have Dr. Daniel Janosik from Southern Evangelical Seminary and Columbia International University and London School of Theology, where he had his degrees from. We also have Dr. Richard Shumack all the way from Australia. And these scholars, if you have never heard of them or have any of their books, I encourage you to buy them as soon as possible because it's great information. Dr. Janosik has a couple of books coming out as well. Also, this is a live show, so you are more than welcome to call in and ask questions for our guests who are here. But in the meantime, we are critiquing the Quran, critiquing the Islamic worldview, and what have you, everything surrounding that. And the reason is because Dr. Janosik has put John of Damascus, a man from history, on the map, and he actually lived from 674 to 749, which is earlier than your 6 most trustworthy hadith collections were written down. He actually worked for the Caliph Abdul Malik, who had the Dome of the Rock built, and that was completed in 691. We're going to get into that as well. But let me share with you real quick before we get back to Dr. Shumack with another question. John of Damascus, again, lived very long ago and before any of the hadith collections. Now, this is a quote that John of Damascus said, that he gave. There's also the superstition of the Ishmaelites, which to this day prevails and keeps people in error, being a forerunner of the Antichrist. From that time to the present, a false prophet named Muhammad has appeared in their midst. This man, after having chanced upon the Old and New Testaments, and likewise, it seems, having conversed with an Arian monk, devised his own heresy. Pause real quick, just to let you know, Arian referring to Arius, which brings us to the Arian controversy.
Right.
That Jesus was a created being, that he was not the Son of God. That was dealt with at the Council of Nicaea,
We're going to get into that,
which we will be getting to on Friday. What happened at the Council of Nicaea? But a recycled version of Arianism is what Jehovah's Witnesses hold to today.
That's right.
They deny the eternal deity of Christ as well, right? They believe that he's a God, which Muslims don't believe, but they don't believe that he's the eternal Son of God incarnate. Continuing with John of Damascus, then having insinuated himself into the good graces of the people by a show of seeming piety, he gave out that a certain book, the Quran, had been sent down to him from heaven. He had set down some ridiculous compositions in this book of his and gave it to them as an object of veneration, claiming it was an eternal book and that he received it from Allah. Now, what I just read to you, was a quote of John of Damascus, who lived from 674 to 749. Now, we're going to get back to him and to other information that devastates the Islamic worldview. But we also have Dr. Richard Shumack on the line, who is a scholar in Islamic studies as well. And we're talking about the Quran and the Bible, knowing that only one can be true, so the other one has to be false. So, Dr. Shumack, has the text of the Quran really been preserved, been perfectly preserved, as many Muslims believe? We have a problem with your... Okay, we got the audio back. Okay. Please restart.
Yeah, sure. There's certainly no evidence that's the case. And so, as Daniel was saying, there's no external evidence. But the external evidence that we are starting to see emerging, archaeological evidence, people who are actually starting to look at the text. And one thing that's very important to understand in this discussion is that Muslims, when you speak to the everyday Muslim, they'll have an extreme degree of certainty about just how unchanged the Quran is, how perfectly preserved it's been. The problem with that is that they will never have looked into why that is. They will just be trusting what they've been told. And those people have been trusting what they've been told. And so they have this, Muslims historically, and there are reasons why, but they have this sort of unfailing trust in the truth of their oral transmission, in the truth of what they've been told by their authorities. But they really don't have good grounds for that. And so it's very unreliable because they're relying on a not authoritative testimony. And so what we're seeing now, for example, one of the PhD theses that I've just recently read is about to be published by a guy named Dan Brubaker. He went and looked at all the earliest extant texts that we have of the Quran all around the world, in museums, in libraries, throughout the Muslim world. He photographed every single Quran, every page, looked through every line, and they are riddled with intentional changes. Every page is riddled with them. There are hundreds all through the earliest Qurans. And so here we have this clear case where even the Qurans that still exist are not unchanged. There is no Uthmanic text that we know of anywhere. There's no text that we can point to. So the tradition says, we heard earlier, that Uthman collated this authoritative text. We don't have it. It doesn't exist. And there's no evidence that the Qurans that Muslims rely on today can correspond to it because it doesn't exist. And so the bottom line is, there is no evidence that the Quran Muslims have today has been unchanged. And the evidence that we are starting to uncover, because now people are starting to do textual criticism on the Quran, and Muslims shut that down 1,000 years ago and wouldn't let it happen. But now that it's starting to happen, the evidence is becoming very clear that the Quran is not perfectly preserved. It has got changes all the way through it. And just the last thing I'll say on that is that I was at a conference a couple of years ago of the International Quran Studies Association. This is probably the prime academic group in the world looking at the text of the Quran. And there were Muslims in that group and non-Muslims. It's secular academia. And the leading Muslim scholars there are starting to say, you know what, the traditional story can't be correct about the origin of the Quran and about its perfect preservation, because the more we start to do text criticism, the more we realize that it just doesn't stack up. The evidence isn't there to support it.
And it is a blessing to have Christians out there who are doing textual criticism of the Quran, since not many Muslims are doing it. And it's great when we do have Muslim scholars who are being intellectually honest and admitting, okay, we have a problem here. Now, that doesn't mean that you're going to know the answer to that problem right away, but at least admitting that there's a problem is the first step, to realizing what is true. Because when we do a show, especially like this, where we're critiquing the Quran, the Islamic worldview, etc., we know that there's 1.6 billion Muslims out there who believe the opposite of this. And this sounds like heresy, of course. It sounds devastating to your worldview. And we don't want you to think, oh, okay, Islam is false. I guess I should become an atheist. No. God exists, and we will do a debate with Muslims against atheists to make the case that God exists. We're just asking you to ask yourself, who is God? Who is Jesus? And the reason why we do this show is to point you to the New Testament, which has been preserved, which is accurate, which has not been changed, which is trustworthy, and of course to Jesus Christ himself, the Lord of Lords, King of Kings and Lord of Lords. But
I have a question
yeah.
for our scholars, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it just came to mind. When is the earliest that we have any kind of hard evidence that the Quran that we now have in Arabic, which I guess is the 1924 Cairo edition, thank you. When is the earliest that we have evidence that what we have now, this 1924 Cairo edition, which is supposedly the Uthmanic text, but anyways, when's the earliest we have that whole text that we can verify in history? I think that's an important question.
Yeah.
Do we have a date or a time period?
Dr. Janosik.
1924.
Okay.
Actually, what you say is very interesting, because that is, in a sense, when it was finally canonized, and that 1924 text is different from earlier ones all through history. But traditionally, you would go back to probably the late 8th century, where you have, even then, some Qurans that only go up to Surah 43, what are called the Topkapi and the Samarkand. These are originally thought to have been Uthmanic texts. Uthman was supposed to have copied out 4, or his scribe would have copied out 4 and sent them to the 4 different centers of the caliphate at that time. But these have been looked at, and there are many mistakes in them, many corrections, but they only have a partial of the Quran. So you're going into the 9th century before you get a full Quran. But you know, talking about the Quran, the text and all, here's a book. I'm trying to get the title here. This is by Keith Small, Textual Criticism and Quran Manuscripts by Keith Small.
Right.
He's a fellow scholar with Dan Brubaker, who's done an excellent job on going through these early Qurans. But there is one that they are pointing to now where they're trying to say that this was contemporary with Muhammad, and it is what is called the Birmingham Quran. It was already collected. It was in a collection of the Mingana manuscripts. He was a scholar in the early 1900s, and is housed in Birmingham University in England. And a PhD student pulled it out and had it radiocarbon dating, and it was dated by the Oxford lab to range between 568 and 645 AD, with a 95% confidence interval, which meant that within 95% of the certainty that it is within this range. Well, that means that it could have been even before Muhammad was born that you have this text.
That's correct.
And there are just 4 pages. It has parts of what we would call now Surah 18 and Surah 19 and parts of Surah 20. But there are some changes that when we compare it with the Quran today. But the radiocarbon dating is for the parchment. So the writing style fits the late 7th century, early 8th century, which you would have other fragments which were found at Sana'a in Yemen by a scholar, Gerd Quinn, or he was called down to study them. And that's another story of the whole puzzle that's coming together. But what it shows is that there seems to have been a collection not only of Jewish stories and Christian liturgy and these Greek legends, but also these early texts that were perhaps written in a different language first and then transliterated into Arabic. But that's another part. But the earliest that we would have, I would say, are late 8th century, early 9th century text of the full Quran.
And it's just interesting thought, random, 1924, the end of the last caliphate.
Caliphate Empire.
Yeah, right after that.
Right.
Interesting.
Right.
Thank you.
Before Joe makes a comment, piggybacking on what Daniel Janosik just said about Keith Small's book, I have another Keith Small book right here. It's called Holy Books Have a History, Textual Histories of the New Testament and the Quran. A little bit thinner book than the one that he held up, but I would suggest...
that's kind of a précis of his larger book, so it's a condensed version for... It's actually, both books are very good. Yeah.
And it's important, too. Dr. Janosik, you had talked about the dating of the Birmingham manuscripts, but how important is it for them to date not only the parchment or the material that it was written on and the ink itself? Because if they're just dating the skin, then technically that's just giving them the date of the animal whose skin it came from, versus dating the lettering and the ink itself. Do different dates come up with those sometimes because of this information that's coming out?
Sure. Usually, though, they would, once they prepare a parchment, which is the skin of a lamb, sheep, ram, goat, they would use it within 5 or 10 years. Sometimes it's stored for longer. But trying to date the ink is very difficult, because you've got to destroy the writing if you're going to get any samples there, and that's nebulous anyway. The style that is used, the type of script, the type of, whether it has diacritical marks or verse separations of certain sorts, that is often a better way to date the Qurans. And when you do that, this Birmingham Quran actually would probably fall within the last decade of the 7th century, the 690s, during the time of Abd-al-Malik, or the early 700s, where you have other fragments of other Qurans with variations. But again, it fits in with that whole scheme of perhaps somebody with a purpose was bringing all this material together to put together what eventually became the Quran later on.
Yeah.
Okay. And
I think it's interesting. You mentioned the Sano manuscripts. I actually had a chance to meet Dr. Gerb Quinn through a mutual friend you and I have, Josh Lingle, and he came out to California when I was there and actually showed us some of his research. But what I find extremely interesting is that after Dr. Quinn left Yemen and finished his research there, the Yemeni Antiquities Authority took all those manuscripts and locked them up and is keeping them intentionally out of public purview right now. Why would they want to do that if they want to sustain the case that the Quran has never been changed?
Just like the communists in Soviet Union.
Yeah, exactly.
No comment.
Right.
No comment. Same reason.
well, Dr. Richard Shumack, we're talking about on this show, as everyone has heard, that it seems like the Quran has changes, has errors, intentional changes. And if that's the case, then why are Muslims throughout the world, usually at least, why are they so confident in their claim that it has been perfectly preserved, that it's never been changed, and that it's completely trustworthy, more trustworthy than any other book out there?
Well, largely it's because Islam has virtually no history of critical thinking. I know that sounds like a rude statement or an extreme statement, but it's certainly true that early on in once the Muslim empire became large and they set up universities, they had groups who started asking difficult questions about Islamic tradition and about Islamic theology, and they were shut down. And so what you had was the philosophy departments, if you would like to call them that, the philosophers were shut down after about 200 or 300 years of Muslim empires, because they were asking difficult, critical questions about Islam. It was okay to ask about science, it was okay to ask about medicine or about astronomy, but don't ask any questions to do with revelation, to do with the Quran, to do with the traditions that have been passed on. And so they were entirely shut down. Even today, you won't find departments of philosophy asking tricky questions in Muslim universities. They just don't do it. And so they have no tradition of critical thinking, because in Islam, you receive knowledge. It's a very traditional way of where knowledge is passed on from authorities, and you don't question it, and you trust it. And even if your intuition tells you that that doesn't seem to make sense, in a traditional society, you're the person who's got the problem because the authority knows more.
Okay. And from what I've
More than a
always
billion
heard,
Muslims, it's extreme because it's passed on.
okay. And I've heard from just about every Muslim who I've talked with, and just the reading that I've done, that, I mean, it's heresy to question the Quran. It's heresy to question even the Hadith, because they look to Muhammad as the perfect man, the perfect Muslim, and the Hadith, at least Al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, contain what he said. What he said to do, what he approved of, what he disapproved of. And if he's the perfect man and the perfect Muslim, well, then it's like there's no even moral standard that exists outside of Muhammad. It's like he is the standard. Nothing that he did could be wrong, which, you know, claiming that someone is the most perfect man throughout time is an okay claim until you look at their life.
Yeah.
You know, if you say, hey, Jesus is the perfect man, then I'll say, amen. You know, let's look at his life and see. But when you look to the earliest biography of Muhammad, the Sirat Rasulullah by Ibn Ishaq, you find material that makes you wonder, okay, this is the perfect man? This is the perfect Muslim?
And not only that, when Ibn Hisham actually took Ibn Ishaq's work and wrote his version of it, because that's essentially what we have now. We don't have Ibn Ishaq's original work. He took Ibn Ishaq's work, and he even says in the beginning, in his introduction, that some of the material that Ibn Ishaq wrote, he discarded it because it painted Muhammad in a very negative light. But what he included is very telling. I'd like to know what was discarded.
Yeah. I mean, it's the same, it goes in the same boat as why did Uthman have these manuscripts destroyed?
Right.
Well, the
It's like you're just
I mean, you know, I mean, how can it get any worse than that? I mean, the very fact that Sirat Rasulullah Ibn Ishaq points out that this was an actual event in Surah 53, that Satan actually put words in Muhammad's mouth, which actually became in the original Quran. And then, of course, there's verses in the Quran that actually say, well, you know, there's never been a prophet that Satan hasn't inserted something in. I mean, my goodness, what more do you need from the Islamic sources themselves to say, hey, you should doubt this book and its authority? I mean, my goodness.
And many Muslims, like I said, many Muslims are not even looking to their original sources.
Right.
Correct.
It's more of just, you know, following the 5 pillars.
Yeah.
And I think, and I'm sure you guys would probably agree with me, that if more Muslims read their sources, more Muslims would be leaving Islam than are leaving Islam right now.
That's correct.
Yes.
Not only because Jesus is visiting Muslims in dreams, and Muslims are finally reading the New Testament more than ever before, but they're also reading their earliest sources. And I would recommend to everyone, in addition to buying Dr. Shumack's books and Dr. Janosik's upcoming books, pick up, you know, a Quran, pick up the Hadith collection, at least Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, or if nothing else, go on Amazon and get the biography that we're talking about, the Sirah, the biographical literature, the Sirat Rasulullah. Type in Alfred Guilam or Ibn Ishaq, and you'll find it's about $30 for like an 800-page.
The life of Muhammad.
The life of Muhammad.
Right.
And that I don't hear quoted by Muslims very often. They seem to be quoting these other sirahs that are much later and romanticize this history and sugarcoat it. So, friends, if you're here with us on this show right now, you can call in live. We would love callers. We had a few callers last night on our second show. And also, remember that this show will be uploaded to YouTube shortly after it concludes. It's a blessing to have you here watching live through the Trinity Channel's website, through YouTube, Facebook, etc. But please share this show. It can be watched by people anywhere as long as they have an internet connection. And we would also ask you to pray for the Trinity Channel, pray for ABN, and also to support ABN financially, because it allows these marathons to take place. It allows debates to take place, and the debates that we have debate vital questions that you don't hear other places. And we are not afraid to have those debates and to post those debates online and let people see this
Right.
stuff.
And the interesting thing is there is no other channel in the world right now sharing the kind of information that you can hear here on ABN and on the Trinity Channel.
right.
Nobody else is doing it.
Not in the English language.
Not in the English language.
In Arabic there is some, but in English, it is absolutely unique.
Right.
Yeah. And people need to be sharing it. People need to be putting it on Facebook, Twitter. Rewatch it. I know sometimes we're talking quick or we're using terms that you're not familiar with. So rewatch the videos on YouTube. Take notes. Share them with people at your church. Share some of this info with your Muslim neighbors when the opportunity arises. And most importantly, just be reaching out to your Muslim neighbors, because this is obviously devastating information to their worldview and to what they actually believe about reality. And many Muslims out there are more devout than Christians. I mean, you talk with your Muslim neighbor at work today, he already prayed this morning before he even came to work. They're praying 5 times a day. Sometimes they're reading the Quran and the Hadith, but many times they're just following these 5 pillars. But again, the reason why the show is happening is because we care about Muslims. We care about all people. We want everyone to repent and put their trust in Christ. But 1.6 billion Muslims in the world means that that's the largest unreached people group who need the gospel. That is the biggest mission field out there as far as the amount of people and what religion they're following. But Islam is not true, and that means that there are eternal consequences that your Muslim neighbors and friends and coworkers have in store for them when they die and they're wrong about who God is, who Jesus is, etc. So we need to take a short commercial break, but we will be back in just a few minutes to continue this great show, Primary Sources, Whose Are Most Reliable.
If you'd like to support ABN's ministry, you can give us a call at 248-416-1300, or you can visit our website at www.abnsat.com. ABN appreciates your support and donations.
ABM Security is in need of your help. The work we do has attracted a lot of opposition that has repeatedly wished us harm, and the measures we had originally taken aren't as effective as we once thought. We need an upgrade to our security system to be more up-to-date to today's standards, and reinforced windows along with thicker doors and locks to make breaking them down a lot more difficult. This isn't an issue anyone likes to talk about, but needs to be addressed. We want to protect our ministry and its employees from serious harm that could be closer than we know. But to do that, we need your support and partnership to make that happen. To donate, call the numbers on your screen, or visit our website at trinitychannel.com.
What you're watching here is very unique. Almost all of the media is saturated with apologies for Islam and a blindness to see the truth of Islam and to hear the truth of Islam. This station is rare. It is precious. It is one of the few places where the truth of Islam can be spoken without fear. And we must see this. In my opinion, when you study the history of the early church, it was not only a religion, but it was a shaper of civilization. And today, in my opinion, the church has become too small and is not engaging in what is really civilizational or cultural war, because we are under attack. The invasion of Islam does not mean a funny kind of church where the people wear a turban on their head. That's what the apologists for Islam would like to say, oh, it's just another religion. No. As a matter of fact, you can tell how much a person knows about Islam if they call it a religion, then they really don't fully understand Islam, because Islam is a complete civilization, or, as Muslims like to say, a total way of life. So, what we're involved here is a civilizational war. It includes religion, but it goes beyond religion. And this station is a linchpin in the defense of our civilization, because if you were watching before the break, we saw how Islam conquered with a sword, but today Islam has come up with another method: skip the sword and just use immigration and corruption of the media. This station stands against this corruption of the media by bringing you the truth. I'm sitting here in a room that has sets, and TV cameras. Believe it or not, these all cost money. No one just drove up a truck and dropped them off for free and said, here, you can have them. We need to support this station, and I'm calling on you to support this station, because what we're doing here is we are supporting our entire civilization. So reach deep, give generously, because our civilization is worth protecting. Believe me.
Hello, friends. Welcome back to ABN and the Trinity Channel for the second International Apologetics Marathon of 2016. My name is Tony Gurule, and I have Pastor Joseph to my right, and on my far right, Joe Carey from RadicalTruth.net. Through Skype, we have two amazing scholars with us. We have Dr. Daniel Janosik, and we have Dr. Richard Shumack, both of whom's books I recommend that you pick up on Amazon as quickly as possible to read and soak up that information, because there's much more information in those books than they can share on a 90-minute show with us. So I encourage you to get their books. And going back to Dr. Daniel Janosik, what is the traditional Muslim view of the origin and authenticity of the Quran? And how does this differ from the archaeological and historical data that we now have that we've been finding the last few years?
Okay, well, we've talked some about the development of the traditional view. Muslims believe that Muhammad, when he was 40 years old, he started receiving these revelations from a cave from the angel Jibril or Gabriel. And for a 23-year period until his death, he continued receiving these revelations, which became the Quran. He memorized them because he apparently did not know how to read or write, and then had his followers memorize them. And then 20 years after Uthman, one of the second caliph, would have brought those together into what would now be known as the Quran, according to the Muslim view, within 20 years. And Uthman was supposed to have burned all the other ones that were not correct, and so on. But that didn't happen. We don't have any historical record for that occurring. Another thing about what they say about the Quran is that it was written in Arabic, which is pure and clear, what they call as mubin. But there are over 100 non-Arabic terms in the Quran, from Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, Syrian, Akkadian, Ethiopian, Persian words are used. In fact, the word Quran itself probably comes from Syriac, from the word Qur'ana, which refers to lectionaries, like Christian lectionaries used for liturgy. And that brings up a very interesting point. Could these stories from the Quran, many of them have been written for Christian churches, Jewish commentaries, and then transliterated into Arabic as Arabic became a written language. It had been an oral language for many, many centuries, but it was during the 7th century that it became more a written language.
Okay.
Let me just read a quote by Gerd Quinn. Joe Carey mentioned this man who worked on the early fragments of found in a mosque in Sana'a, Yemen, dated around the last decade of the 7th century, 690 to early 700s. And Quinn says this, quote, "The Quran claims for itself that it is mubin, or clear. But if you look at it, you will notice that every 5th sentence or so simply doesn't make sense. Many Muslims will tell you otherwise, of course, but the fact is that a 5th of the Quranic text is just incomprehensible. Why is this?" He goes on. "This is what has caused the traditional anxiety regarding translation. If the Quran is not comprehensible, if it can't even be understood in Arabic, then it's not translatable into any language. That is why Muslims are afraid. Since the Quran claims repeatedly to be clear, but it is not, there is an obvious and serious contradiction. Something else must be going on." And that's why I believe that the Quran came from these earlier sources, were transliterated into Arabic, but there was a purpose, and that purpose really comes together under a caliph named Abdul Malik.
Now, when Gerd Quinn is talking about this, and what is he saying about the Quran still being developed or coming about in the 700s rather than within 20 years of Muhammad's death? What is he pointing to specifically that is making this case?
Well, the dating of the fragments, the type of writing style, there seems to be a progression toward an accepted text, which occurred later on in the 700s, around the time of John of Damascus writing his book. And it seems like what is happening is that I would say Abdul Malik, who was the leader of the whole Umayyad Empire, had an idea that he had to have for his government to be legitimate, like other governments, he needed to have a religion, he needed to have a book, he needed to have a prophet. Chose Muhammad as a prophet, chose Islam, the submission to Allah as the religion, which was basically a conglomeration, I believe, of Jewish apocalyptic views, Unitarian Christian views, where Jesus was prophet but not God himself, and he needed a book to put all that together. So what Gerd Quinn is showing is that there is a progression, and there seems to be a progression toward a unified standard. And this is something that Dan Brubaker and Keith Small also show as they develop their whole system of showing the transitions and the mistakes and so on.
Okay, great. So we see that there's a whole lot of errors that are what we find in the Quran, which not only, like Dr. Janosik talked about, the historical errors, but we find theological errors as well. And we bring this up all the time when we looked at the Quran, which says, or it talks about the Trinity being God, Mary, and Jesus. And that is not something that Christianity teaches. That's not something that is found in the Bible. So that is a theological error that's in there. I mean, we would agree that is false, but why is it in the Quran to begin with? Because that either tells us that Allah inspired a mistake or had Gabriel share with Muhammad a theological mistake.
Or he just didn't know what Christians believed.
Or he didn't know what Christians believed. Or that Allah isn't, or the Islamic view of God, Allah is not accurate, right, and that the Quran was, of course, not an eternal book. But Muslim scholars generally avoid textual criticism, which, again, many Christians are doing instead, which is a good thing. But Dr. Shumack, why do Muslims usually avoid that? Why do they avoid textual criticism of the Quran itself?
Well, like I was saying before, there's been an avoidance of asking critical questions. And largely it's because when the early Muslim scholars, like others, when they started asking tricky theological questions, even of the Quran, the answers didn't fit very well with Muslim orthodoxy, and so they were shut down. The other thing too is, and you mentioned before about how Muslims think it's heretical. There's a strong resistance within the Quran to methodological doubt, which is sort of the essence of critical thinking. The idea that you might doubt whether your beliefs are necessarily true. So on average, the Quran mentions hell or judgment about every 7th verse, and doubt, the whole idea of doubt, is very, very strongly linked with you being judged and you being drawn away from faith. And so there's this very strong resistance to asking questions, because the fear is if you doubt, if you question, then that leads straight to hell. And so that's part of the mindset of Islam. And obviously that doesn't promote good critical thinking.
And there's a great book surrounding that area of Islamic history, which I think is very intriguing. And I'm like Dr. Shumack, I'm really focused on philosophy in Islam, and that's what you will find in his book, The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity as well. But Dr. Janosik, you brought up earlier, you've mentioned the Dome of the Rock a couple of times, which was completed in 691. And I mentioned earlier in the show the term epigraphy. Epigraphy being archaeological writings on, say, the Dome of the Rock or other archaeological structures. So what do the inscriptions on the Dome of the Rock, and people can look these up online for themselves. Just type in Dome of the Rock, and you'll see all kinds of pictures, including the inscriptions. So what do those inscriptions indicate about the formation of the Quran?
Okay, two things to realize beforehand. One is that in the 7th century, Arabic was developing as a written language. It seems to have come from Nabatean Aramaic, which is a base language for Hebrew and Syriac, or Aramaic is the base language. And so it was developing during this time. It wasn't until the early 700s, in the time of Abd-al-Malik, that his governor, al-Hajjaj, came up with a system of the diacritical marks so that you could pronounce the vowels. It would have a consistency at that point. But in 691, Abd-al-Malik, and I believe that he was trying to orchestrate a religion, what I would call an intermediate monotheism, where he and others apparently did not like the idea that Jesus was considered God. He considered Jesus as a prophet. He was following a Jewish apocalyptic view of the world. So he was merging these things together, it seems, and he needed the book. And so the Dome of the Rock seems to be a propaganda piece where he started putting these ideas together in an early form of Arabic without the diacritical marks. And on the etchings there talk about the creed, the early creed of Islam. There is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his prophet. So he does mention Muhammad at that time, but it may be a Muhammad that refers to a chosen one. And actually, it could refer to Jesus Christ as a chosen one, as the chosen prophet that they did revere, but not as God. And so he has these etchings on the Dome of the Rock, dated around 691, 692, that seem to talk about this particular idea that Abd-al-Malik is putting forth. But I have a quote here by Patricia Crona, a scholar, who says that there's no hard evidence for the existence of the Quran, quote, in any form before the last decade of the 7th century, unquote. Even the verses found inscribed in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which is 691 AD, attest only to the presence of materials similar to verses found in the Quran, but they're not the same. They're different in the Quran, which would have, I believe, developed later after the Dome of the Rock and Abd-al-Malik.
So there are scholars in this area who, because of this information, are actually questioning the existence of Muhammad himself?
Well, Muhammad, as the person that you have in the traditional legend or the traditional story of Islam, yes. Somebody was back there, some apocalyptic preacher, but we don't have anything written down. As Joe Carey and Pastor Joseph have said, the earliest that you have is probably 150 to 200 years afterwards. That's like somebody trying to write the first biography of Abraham Lincoln, or even further back, Thomas Jefferson, today, without any other resources other than stories that they would have heard coming down the line orally. Right. Well, that's what we have with Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham in the earliest biography. So there's a lot that just does not fit with the traditional story. So you mentioned, what did Muhammad exist? Somebody did, and but not the Muhammad, I think, that you have in the traditional Muslim view.
Right. And even if the traditional Muslim view of Muhammad is correct, and again, if you were to throw out all this information, which you don't want to do because it is reasonable evidence, Dr. Shumack, even if the true Muhammad did exist, which I would say for the benefit of the doubt, we would stick with, and of course with our Muslim friends.
Yeah, let's assume that for a moment.
Yeah, let's assume for a moment that Muhammad did exist and he is the actual man in history that Muslims believe that he is. Is it coherent to say that Muhammad had no input in the Quran whatsoever?
I don't think it is coherent to say that. So it's another feature of the Quran that Muslims will point to say that The evidence for its miraculousness is that it was purely from God, and so that's part of it being unchanged, uncorrupted, uncorruptible, is that there's no human input. But even as you say, even if we assume the accounts are accurate, and I don't think we can, certainly not to the degree that Muslims say they are, even that we're relying very heavily on the Hadith, not even the Quran at this point, to tell us the story of how it all sort of developed, and they're highly unreliable. Even Muslims recognize that they're very patchy in their reliability. But as you say, even for sake of argument, we say, okay, it happened the way that it says. The problem is that Muhammad was intimately involved in the revelation process of the Quran. Muhammad had to remember things. Muhammad had to he recited that he was guided by God. And at that point, well, I'd want to say, well, how does that actually work? That sounds suspiciously like a Christian view of Scripture where men can be carried along by the Holy Spirit. But whatever else it is, it's certainly not that the Quran just dropped out of heaven. Muhammad's memory was involved, his recitation skills were involved, his cognition was very heavily involved. Certainly there was human involvement. And that's a problem not for Christians. We understand that God can use humans. That's a problem for Islam, who wants to make a very strong claim that the Quran is this eternal, perfect, divine a divine book without any human agency whatsoever. And that's just not how it happened.
And this history, that's why it's so vital for people to be checking this out and to be intellectually honest and set aside your presuppositions for just a few minutes at least to look to this information and compare it to what you believe. And whatever you believe, I mean, we have the freedom to believe whatever we want, but ask yourself this: why do I believe what I believe? What evidence do I have personally that I know about, other than my subjective belief, that what I believe is actually true? Because we want to look to evidence to the world outside of ourselves, look to reality, look to history, archaeology, manuscript evidence, etc., in reference to the Quran and in reference to the Bible. Which one is stronger? Because even if Muhammad did exist in the exact way that Muslims believe, we still have a huge issue with the Hadith collections being the most reliable collections. Even Sahih al-Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, in the Surat Rasulullah by Ibn Ishaq, 150 years after Muhammad?
To almost 200 years in some cases.
And the Hadith collections saying, oh yeah, this person heard this person, heard this person, heard this person, heard Muhammad say it. So they have a isnad, a chain of translators. But why would you trust a chain of people written in a book, 100 years or more after the time of Muhammad, when you can just look to the New Testament and read what eyewitnesses saw and wrote down?
Right.
Mm-hmm. You don't need a chain of people. You just need the eyewitnesses themselves.
Right.
And we only have about 11 minutes left in this show. So what I want to do is give Dr. Janosik and Dr. Shumack both an opportunity, a few minutes each, to share whatever you would like, wrapping up what you think people should know, Christians and Muslims. And also, too, in these, let's say give 4 minutes each, because I also want you guys to share with our viewers, okay, well, people are probably wondering, well, what can I look to then? If the Islamic sources aren't reliable, well, you're saying Christianity is true, so what evidence is there that the Bible is reliable, that it is accurate, that it has not been changed, and that it is completely set apart from the Islamic sources because of its history, of its compilation, the amount of manuscripts that we have, the earliest codices or the earliest forms of a book? We have early Bibles hundreds of years before Muhammad was even born. So there's a lot of problems here. So let's go to Dr. Janosik first, a few minutes, sir, just to say what you'd like to share, and also give us some evidence for the reliability of the Bible as well.
Thank you, Tony, and appreciate this opportunity to be on the show and share these things. Again, I'm looking at a different venue of research in the early coming together of Islam, the Quran, and the ideas of Muhammad, how that fits in with what you just mentioned, the Hadith. I believe the Hadith, because they were probably put together to promote particular political sides 150, 200 years after Muhammad's supposed death. But the basic idea is that there may have been a intermediate monotheism where a group of Arabs, as they were coming up and they were conquering, immigrating, migrating north, and finding the Byzantines had retreated, they had this power now. They were in control, and so they were developing their own religion, and also the document of that religion, which would have been the Quran, coming from a collection of earlier sources: Christian liturgy, Jewish commentaries, Greek stories, legends, Arabic stories from the Old Testament, things that were heard and put together. And some of that from the time of this particular person who would have been called Muhammad. And later on, I think a lot of it came together during Abd al-Malik, even having been written, a lot of it being written during that time, perhaps from al-Hajjaj or others under his commission, because that's where you have the longer surahs, the ones that deal with the government, the structure of the community, and so on, what are called often the Medinan ones. But you have a lot of problems. There are variations. You have a lot of corrections and progression, showing that there was a movement toward a certain idea of what the Quran had to be. So here we're talking about a book that has a lot of corrections, a lot of speculation, a lot of unknown origins. And we compare that with the Bible, where, as you mentioned, we have the eyewitnesses writing what they saw, what they heard. John is a great example. He says that he was there. He witnessed these things. He heard these words. He wrote them down. And he lived during that time to see Christianity grow. But he was there with Jesus. He saw Jesus risen from the dead. He saw Jesus ascended into heaven. He had all these memories of being with him and seeing the miracles, and he writes about these things. And then you have Paul coming along, who's contemporary with that situation. And Paul is not disputed as being the one who wrote a number of the letters that we have in the New Testament. And these are early letters. We have documents that go all the way back to the 1st century. We're coming up with even portions of the gospel that are being dated within 20 years, 20, 25, 30 years of their the actual original manuscript of that eyewitness who was there. So the evidence is overwhelming for the Bible, the historicity. Archaeology supports it. Archaeology does not support the Quran. Historical records support the Bible. Non-Christian writers talk about Jesus as existing and being crucified and supposedly rising from the dead. And these are non-Christians. You don't have that with Muhammad or the Quran. You don't have that until 150, 200 years afterwards. Why? That's 600 years later. It should be in the full light of history, as they want to say, but it wasn't in the full light of history because a lot of that probably did not happen, and it was put together for a purpose to create a government, or to have for the government a book, a prophet, and a religion.
Sum up what has been said tonight, and great sources to point people to. And friends, there are many sources out there on the reliability of the Bible and what we know as actual history, which includes church history, of course. But Dr. Richard Shumack, to give you a few minutes, sir, as well, what would you like to say to wrap up this specific topic that we are talking about? And also, what information would you like to share with Christians out there who you would like to be better equipped, and also the Muslims out there who you would like to point towards truth, of course?
Sure. Well, I won't repeat the historical arguments that Dan's just made, and I agree with him. And I think the bottom line is that for all those reasons and for many others, the weight of historical evidence falls very, very, very heavily on the side of the Bible being reliably, the process of it coming to being reliably and then being transmitted reliably. History backs that up. It just doesn't in the case of the Quran. And really, think the question I want to ask a Muslim is, how do you know? You believe so strongly, and most Muslims I meet and my friends, they believe so strongly that the Quran is unchanged. But how do you really know? And how do the people who are telling that to you know, when Muslims historically have never looked into it? Muslim scholars have never done text criticism. How do you know? How can you be certain? I just want to ask how. The confidence I have is because Christians have done it. They've done the work. They've done the scholarly work. They've done the archaeological work. They've done the historical work. And so it's a confidence in the reliability of our scriptures that are grounded in asking the hard questions and finding that our doctrines of scripture, they stand up to scrutiny. Whereas Muslims just don't have the history of doing that. And so again, what I want to say to a Muslim today is, how do you really know? Is your certainty just a felt certainty, or is it based on good reasons?
And all of us, Dr. Janosik, Dr. Richard Shumack, myself, Pastor Joseph, Joe Carey, we all love Muslims. We care about where they spend eternity. And I look to Muslims out there who are obviously very devout people. Mm-hmm. Imagine if they were that devout about the truth as they are for a lie. You know, as we know, I mean, we talked with CL on the last show. When a Muslim becomes a born-again Christian, they put your average quote-unquote Christian to shame.
They do.
And how devout they are. I mean, that same devotion to what they thought to be true is now switched to what is actually true.
Right.
So it is our blessing for you to be here with us. And as you have heard, friends, this is vital information that needs to be shared with everybody, with Christians, with non-Christians as well. So please share this video. And we talked about the reliability of the Bible a little bit, but what I want to point you to is if you go to the Trinity Channel's YouTube channel, you'll find last night's show of should Muslims believe that Jesus died on a cross, because we went a lot more in depth on the reliability of the Bible. Coming up later this week, what happened at the Council of Nicaea, and also I believe next Monday is a great show on were the Gospels written by eyewitnesses, which is, again, piggybacking on something that we brought up tonight. So we would encourage you to not only look into these issues, but to support ABN and the Trinity Channel, because what other channel can you turn to watch a show like this? I mean, we just gave you 90 minutes of info that you would actually have to go and pay to take classes at a seminary, and actually a Christian seminary of Islamic that focuses on Islamic studies, not your average Islamic studies university out there that is funded by people in other countries that are giving you the traditional view only and watering it down at that.
And you won't get it at a Christian seminary, because what we're getting is not just from one Christian seminary.
Right.
It's from the best from around the world.
Yeah.
You'd have to go to all the Christian seminaries that are on the ball, as we say, to get what we're getting tonight.
And here we got two scholars that came to us from their location.
Right.
This
Praise
is what we're
God.
doing on this channel.
Praise God.
And I thank Richard Shumack and I thank Daniel Janosik both for being here tonight.
Amen.
Great input.
Yeah.
Amen.
And I encourage you to check out their books. Again, we have Dr. Richard Shumack's The Wisdom of Islam and the Foolishness of Christianity, and Witnessing to Western Muslims, a Worldview Approach to Sharing Your Faith. Also, go on Amazon tonight. Now, Dr. Daniel Janosik has two books that are coming out in the near future. One of them is available for pre-order. John of Damascus, First Apologist to the Muslims, the Trinity and Christian Apologetics in the Early Islamic Period. And if you just heard about John of Damascus tonight, you're probably going to go get that book right away, because you're like, hey,
who is this guy?
I want to know more about this guy, right? He lived closer to the time of Muhammad than any of the reliable hadith collections.
Right.
And he lived closer to the time of Muhammad than what we are finding as far as the actual compilation of the Quran. Right. So friends, thank you for being with us. Thank you so much to Dr. Daniel Janosik and Dr. Richard Shumack. God bless you. Come back tomorrow night to watch 2 more shows for God's glory. God bless you.
ABN and the Trinity Channel's newsletter are coming to you. In the newsletter, we talk about our future plans to expand, the Second International Apologetics Marathon of 2016, and the dire needs of a ministry. We have several projects that need your support to come to life, such as studio equipment, an update to our security, monthly dues, and aiding us in fixing the water damage done to the ministry. If you would like to receive a hard copy of the newsletter,